Hello and welcome from every corner of this turning world. Whether you're listening from a quiet cabin in the north, a city that never sleeps, or somewhere in between, I'm glad you're here. Before we drift back through the centuries, feel free to leave a comment. Let us know where you're listening from, what time it is, where you are, or simply how your night has been. I read every note like a whisper from across time, and if you enjoy these slow journeys into the forgotten past, do consider subscribing, not for numbers or noise, but so that each story can find you again, like the soft creak of a floorboard in an old house you love returning to. Tonight, close your eyes and follow the wind westward, past the chalky cliffs of Albion, across the mist-slicked meadows of an England still raw with fear, still waking into itself. The year is somewhere in the 800s. Kings are fragile maps or guesses, and along the eastern coasts the sails of northern raiders rise like ghosts from the sea. You are not in a castle. You are not a knight. You are in the dirt, quite literally. Your hands are calloused from the plow, and the only blade you know is the one you use to cut barley. The village is small. It doesn't even have a name that anyone outside would recognize. Just a clutch of thatched roofs, huddled beneath an open sky, the kind of place no song would remember unless something strange happened. Something brave. Something no one expected from a man like you. No one chose you for this story. There were no horns, no banners, no oaths sworn in stone halls. You just happened to be there when the wrong sails appeared on the horizon, and you happened not to run. They came with axes and fire, speaking no language but violence. You had no armor, no army, just a wooden shaft and a curved blade dulled from years of turning earth. But the ground remembered your feet. The trees remembered your silence. And when they came to burn your world down, you stood up with nothing to lose. This is not a tale of triumph. It's not about one man defeating many. But it is about the way courage smells like sweat and damp soil. About the sound a man makes when he stands still while others flee. And about the echo that moment left behind, barely remembered, almost forgotten. But not tonight. Tonight we will walk behind you as the smoke curls above the treetops. We will hear the creak of your breath, the shift of your boots in the wet field. We will watch what happens when one man decides that his home is worth breaking for. Not all heroes wear steel. Some wear mud and blood in the silence of those who never asked to be remembered. So, settle in. Let the past wrap around you like fog on a fen. We'll begin now, not in glory, but in the aching stillness just before it breaks. You were bent at the waist, hands sunk into the dark softness of the earth. The barley was nearly waist-high now, pale gold, and whispering against your sleeves with every breeze. Summer had been gentle, so far enough rain, not too much sun, and the roots held fast. You liked mornings like this, the kind where the sky stretched blue and undisturbed, and the crows stayed quiet for once. But something wasn't right. You felt it before you saw it. A stillness in the birds, a pause in the wind. The kind of silence that pushes into your ears and stays there, too full, too round. You straightened slowly, resting your weight on the hoe, squinting into the far edge of the world. Your field sloped gently downward, and beyond it a thin line of trees marked where the land met the river. The river had always been your friend. Fish in the spring mist in the morning, and a soft hush that reminded you of the songs your mother used to hum when you were small. But now the mist rose heavier than it should have, thicker, tinged with a color you didn't trust. Not gray, not white, more like smoke. You rubbed your hands on your tunic, sticky with earth and sweat, and took a few steps toward the edge of the field. Maybe someone had lit a brush fire. Maybe old father, too, who was always burning something he shouldn't, had set his fence ablaze again. But no, this wasn't the smoke of accident. It came in slow coils, too deliberate, too steady. It moved like a signal. Your heart, always steady, now beat in uneven thuds. Far off, so far you could have missed it if you blinked. A flicker of color cut across the trees. A red sail, maybe, or a roof catching fire. It vanished almost instantly, but the shape remained in your mind, branded like an afterimage from looking at the sun too long. You remembered the stories. You'd heard them from travelers, monks, and those few who had come from across the sea with nothing left but their feet and broken prayers. Stories of ships that bore dragons, of men with pale eyes and twisted metal in their beards. But they were always someone else's problem. You turned slowly, the way a deer might when it's just caught scent of the wrong thing. The wind shifted. The smell came clearer now, charred wood, wet leather, and something sour underneath. You'd smelled that once before, years ago, when lightning struck a neighboring barn and burned 2 goats inside. It was the smell of something dying. You walked faster now across the furrows and through the gate your father had once carved. The hinges creaked even though you'd oiled them last week. You didn't lock the barn door. You didn't gather your tools. Something in your bones told you, just move. The village lay just beyond the ridge, clustered like children beneath a sleeping bear. Thatched roofs, crooked fences, chickens that never stayed where they were told. You passed them all without words, heading toward the bell. No one had rung the bell in 5 years, not since the fever. You reached it just as Matty, the old miller's son, came panting up from the creek path. His face was white, blotched with red around the edges. He couldn't speak at first, just pointed. His eyes were wide in that way you remembered from when he broke his arm, not in pain but disbelief. You didn't wait for the priest. You didn't wait for the elders to argue. You grabbed the rope and pulled hard. The sound tore through the sky like a scream. You pulled again, and again, until the clapper rang with a wildness that felt too loud for such a peaceful place. People poured out of homes, some with blankets, others clutching children, most barefoot. The baker's wife still had flour on her nose. No one asked what was wrong, they just looked to you. It struck you then how strange that was. You weren't anyone special. You weren't a leader or a fighter. You were just the man who always helped patch roofs, who fixed hinges and made sure the children didn't fall into the well. But now every face turned toward yours like you had the answers. You didn't. I saw smoke, you said simply, down by the river. That was all it took. A murmur rose like wind through dry grass. A few men muttered about the watchtower. Someone mentioned a deer hunter who hadn't returned. A mother clutched her child so hard the boy cried out. The priest arrived, last robes, flapping his hair uncombed. He tried to speak, but you shook your head. Words didn't matter now. The smoke was coming. That was enough. You stood still in the center of them all, breathing heavy dirt still on your palms. You watched the people of your village unravel, fear showing in every twitch, every shifting eye. Some shouted, others prayed, a few began packing without being told. And in all of it you felt strangely calm. Maybe it was because you'd already seen it. The flicker of red, the shape of sails, the slow curl of death reaching inland on river winds. Or maybe deep down you already knew this story would not be written with ink or carved into stone. It would be felt in the soil, in the fields that bore witness, in the bones of those who stayed. You didn't run. You gripped the wooden shaft in your hand a little tighter, listening to the wind shift again. The smoke was coming closer now, and you would be here when it arrived. The village never had a real wall, just a line of stones and brush that marked where the known ended and the wild began. It had always been enough. For wolves, for storms, for the kind of life that asked only for patience and a good harvest. But not now. You stood beside the others just outside the chapel. It was small, barely larger than a shed, with walls of wattle and daub and a cross carved into the door by someone who had long since forgotten why. The priest was lighting a single candle, his hands trembling. His voice tried for steadiness, but the words scattered, falling flat into the dust. Children sat on steps, their feet swinging. Women braided each other's hair with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. The blacksmith was sharpening a knife, not a sword, just a kitchen knife, his hands stained with soot and something darker. And still they looked to you. You hadn't asked for that, hadn't said anything beyond what you saw, but silence carries weight, and yours had drawn them in like moths to the one flame that didn't flicker. A boy no older than 10 tugged at your sleeve. He didn't speak, just pointed toward the hill. The smoke had grown thicker. It was no longer just a distant haze, but a line now moving, rising, wrapping the sky in warning. You didn't hesitate. You nodded once, then turned and walked. Others followed, some with pitchforks, some with nothing but their voices. Past the granary, past the fields where scarecrows twisted in the wind like broken men, past the stones that marked where your grandfather had buried a horse during the dry year. There was a rise at the edge of the barley. From there you could see the whole valley down to the reeds and across the water. That's where you saw it. The river shimmered like oil beneath the morning sun, and from its belly rose the ships. Not many, 3, maybe 4. Carved like monsters, with prows shaped like snakes or dragons or wolves, their mouths open as if ready to bite. The sails were red, not bright, but the color of old blood, faded and soaked too many times in salt. Men moved aboard them, shadows with gleaming bits of metal, pale hair like straw whipped by the breeze. You couldn't hear them yet, but you felt them. The air seemed to lean back, like even the wind didn't want to get too close. Someone behind you gasped. Another began to cry. You turned slowly. Looked at them, your people, your neighbors. the ones who had laughed over cider and argued about pigs and held hands at weddings. They were terrified. And not one of them had ever been taught how to kill. The baker hands dusted in flour. The potter with clay still under his nails. The girl who sang to her geese. All of them suddenly fragile like dried leaves ready to be crushed. You looked back at the ships. One was already docking. You felt your grip tighten again around the shaft of your hoe. It was worn smooth where your hands had held it for years. The blade was chipped dull in places, not meant for anything more dangerous than weeds. But it was what you had. The priest spoke again, this time louder. "We should pray." No, someone else said, "We should run." Voices rose. Fear boiled over. People shouted, pulled at sleeves, pointed back toward the woods. The old path to the next village was overgrown but passable. Someone claimed to know a shortcut. Someone else cursed the gods. You didn't move. You watched them scatter like frightened birds, some clutching children, some carrying sacks that would slow them down. And you thought, if everyone runs, who stays? Your home was here. Not just your house, but your life. The fence you built with your father. The stump where you sharpened tools. The row of beans your mother had planted in neat lines that still grew wild each spring. The idea of leaving it all, of letting it burn, felt wrong in your bones. Not noble. Not brave. Just wrong. Like breaking something you'd spent your whole life learning how to hold. You knelt slowly, pressing your palm into the soil. It was still warm, still alive. You whispered to no one, to nothing, "I'm not leaving." And then you stood. Not like a hero in a story, just like a man who had decided. A few others remained, not many. The blacksmith. A widow whose legs couldn't carry her far. The priest, too stunned to act. 3 boys, too scared to choose either way. You gathered them with your eyes one by one. Said no words, just looked. Then you turned back toward the fields. The smoke was closer now. You could hear shouting, faint like thunder, on the edge of memory. You walked toward it. Each step slow, deliberate, as if marking the land with goodbye. And behind you, a few footsteps followed. The earth shifted beneath your boots, not with tremors, but with the nervous stir of creatures, sensing what men often ignore. The crows no longer circled. The foxes had fled. Even the flies had fallen silent, hovering like forgotten dust motes between the barley stalks. You led the way down the eastern slope past the leaning scarecrow with its crooked smile and tattered shirt. It looked more alive now than it ever had, its hollow face turned toward the distant river, as though it too were watching the arrival of things that did not belong. The others behind you walked without speaking. The blacksmith carried a hammer. One of the boys clutched a broomstick like it meant something. The widow gripped her rosary so tightly you heard the beads creak. No one asked what to do. At the bottom of the slope, the fields gave way to marshy ground, and beyond that, the river widened. There were birch trees along the bank, pale and trembling, their trunks like bones reaching skyward. You crouched behind a thicket, your breath caught halfway between silence and warning. And there, just beyond the reeds, the first Viking stepped onto English soil. He was tall, though not monstrously so, bare-armed with a leather strap across his chest and a round shield slung over his back. His hair was knotted, his beard twisted, and his eyes held no urgency. He was not here to fight, not yet. He was here to take. Behind him more followed, 10, 15, maybe more. They moved like men who had done this before. Boots, heavy axes, carried like extensions of their arms, not weapons but tools. One of them laughed. Another spit into the earth and smeared it with his boot. They hadn't seen you, not yet. But they would. You turned back toward your group. Only the blacksmith met your gaze. The others looked to the ground, to their hands, to the nothingness that always fills the air just before something breaks. You whispered, "We don't fight them here." The blacksmith nodded. "They expect fear," you added, voice like a breath. "Let's not give them that." You led them back up the slope, ducking behind the hedge line, your heart pounding. Every rustle sounded too loud, every breath too sharp. But the wind was still in your favor, blowing inland, carrying your scent away. By the time you reached the edge of the village, more smoke had joined the sky. They'd set a storehouse on fire. The old grain barn. You could hear it crackling, the flames like dry laughter echoing across the field. You didn't panic. Instead, you walked calmly toward your home. Not to hide, not to pray, but to gather. Your hoe was already in your grip, but you found the spare handle you'd carved last spring just in case. You lashed it to the broken gate near your door and drove it into the ground like a marker, the kind old warriors might have used to claim their place. The blacksmith joined you. His face was smudged, his eyes calm in that heavy way men sometimes get before they bleed. He handed you a short piece of chain. "If it comes to that," he said simply, You nodded. A creaking sound broke the air. The widow had climbed onto the roof of the chapel with a bucket of pitch. Her hands shook, but she poured slowly, methodically, letting the black liquid coat the shingles. When the sun struck it, the chapel glistened like a beetle's shell, shiny, dangerous, not sacred. From below, the priest looked up at her with wonder. He made no attempt to stop her. The boy with the broomstick had disappeared. You found him minutes later dragging a basket of chicken bones and broken pottery from behind the butcher's hut. When you asked what he was doing, he said, "They won't know what's real." And somehow that made sense. So you let him. Everyone was preparing in their own way, not like soldiers, but like survivors. Not with glory, but with grit. By mid-afternoon, the first scream reached your ears. High, short, then silence. You didn't move. You waited. And then came the second, longer, sharper ending in something wet. Still you waited. Because running now would mean chaos, and chaos was the one thing you couldn't afford. The sun began to dip, throwing long shadows across the field. The light turned amber, then gold, then the color of old parchment. And finally you saw them. 2 Vikings. Not the full group, just scouts likely. One carried a torch, the other held a spear lazily in one hand. They walked like they owned the land, like this was already theirs. You stepped forward, alone, not rushing, not brandishing, just walking. The one with the torch stopped first. His eyes narrowed. He said something in a language you didn't know, but his tone said everything. It was disbelief. You were supposed to be gone. The spear-bearer stepped up, now cautious. They were unsure. Your calm had disrupted their rhythm. You said nothing, just raised your hoe and held it as if it were a sword passed down from ancestors, not a tool caked with years of mud. And you smiled, not wide, not cruel, just enough to say, "I see you." They stopped advancing. The one with the torch raised it slightly, trying to show power. But his hand trembled. Maybe from the wind. Maybe not. Behind you, the door to the chapel creaked open. The blacksmith stepped out, hammer in one hand, fire poker in the other. Then the boy appeared beside a barrel, holding his broomstick like a spear. One by one they emerged, silent, steady. And suddenly the 2 invaders didn't look so confident. They turned, slowly, and walked back the way they came. You didn't follow. You didn't cheer. You just stood there in the fading light and let the earth remember your stillness. Because this wasn't the end, just the first refusal. That night the stars were hidden. Clouds moved slow and low across the sky, dulling even the moonlight into a pale smear. The fire from the burned granary still smoldered, a dying breath of orange rising behind the tree line. No one slept. Not truly. You sat beside your door, back against the rough timber, the hoe resting across your knees like a sleeping animal. The air smelled of damp grass, ash, and something older, the kind of scent that comes before a storm. Inside your home, a candle burned low. You could hear someone breathing, one of the boys curled up near your hearth. His breaths were shallow and quick but steady. He hadn't spoken since dusk. Across the yard, the blacksmith tended the fire he had built beneath an overturned cart, shielding the glow from sight. He was melting down scrap horseshoes, rusted nails, broken hinges, anything he could shape into points or edges. Not weapons exactly, but symbols of resistance. The village was no longer a village. It had become something in between, no longer only a home, not yet a battlefield. A place suspended in waiting. You heard a sound. Not footsteps, not shouting, a soft creak like leather stretched too far. You stood silently and stepped out into the night, moving along the edge of your fence. Your eyes adjusted slowly. There, at the edge of the barley, stood a shape, low-crouched, moving with caution. You raised your hand, signaling to the blacksmith. He didn't call out. He simply disappeared into shadow. You crept forward. The damp grass muffled your steps. Your heart made more noise than your feet. And then the shape resolved itself into a man. But not one of the villagers. A Viking alone. Younger than you expected. His face barely more than a beard's beginning. His eyes wide darting. He wasn't armed, at least not in his hands. He turned when he heard you, mouth opening to speak, but no words came. You stopped just out of reach, holding your hoe as though it mattered more than it ever had. He didn't charge, didn't shout. He raised his hands slowly, and then something strange happened. He pointed not at you, not at the village, but behind him toward the trees. Then he placed his fingers against his lips and lowered himself to the earth, pressing one cheek to the ground. Listening. You didn't understand, but you crouched too. And then you heard it. A distant murmur, boots, many of them, moving fast, not toward you but away, up the ridge toward the west. You looked at the boy again. His hands were trembling, his eyes filled with something you couldn't name. Fear, yes, but more than that. Shame. And then he ran, not toward the others, not back to the ships, but into the woods as if trying to disappear entirely. You didn't chase him. Instead, you stood and looked to the sky. The wind had shifted. The smoke that had drifted inland all day was now curling back out toward the sea. The scent of burning wood faded, replaced by the colder breath of night. By dawn it was clear. The Vikings were gone. Not entirely, not forever. But for now their ships had vanished from the river. No sails, no torches, no laughter, only churned earth where their boots had been. You walked the edge of the field scanning for signs, broken stalks, footprints, the glint of a dropped blade. You found a helmet dented lying near the water's edge, and beside it a small pouch of coins that no villager would have dared carry. They hadn't finished what they came to do. You gathered what remained. Others emerged slowly as if waking from a shared dream. The widow carried a pot of stew out to the center of the square. Someone else brought bread. Children peeked from doorways, eyes wide but dry. The priest rang the bell once, not in warning but in recognition. You sat near the fire with the blacksmith, saying nothing. He handed you a piece of twisted iron. It looked vaguely like a star. He didn't explain it, and you didn't ask. Around you the village didn't celebrate. There were no cheers, no songs, no speeches. Just breathing, just living. And in that you found a kind of peace. You stayed by the fields all that day, fixing what you could, pulling down what had burned, replanting where the soil still held promise. The boy, who had used the broomstick, sat beside you for a time, not speaking, just watching your hands. When he finally asked, "Are they coming back?" you said simply, "Maybe," and he nodded as if that answer was enough. That night when the stars returned, you lit no fire. You sat in the dark and listened to the frogs return to the stream, to the owls reclaim their trees, to the wind slip again through the barley. You hadn't saved a kingdom, but the earth beneath you was still yours, and that for now was victory enough. The next morning came gray and uncertain. Mist hugged the fields like a second skin, and the sun was a dull smear behind the clouds, unwilling to shine too brightly. The village smelled of wet ashes and newly upturned soil, and everything felt quieter than it should have. Not peaceful. Not yet. Just muted. You stepped out into the open barefoot, letting the dew soak your heels. The earth clung to you, like it recognized your weight, as though the ground itself had remembered where you'd stood the day before and why. Around you, life began its careful crawl back into place. The potter was repairing the cracks in her kiln with mud and straw. The widow had lined up a row of battered pots and placed herbs in each as if to say something will grow. The blacksmith hadn't slept. You found him sitting near the chapel, head bowed over a pile of scrap, his hands twitching even in rest. You offered him bread, but he waved it away. "Not yet," he murmured. "Still too much war in my hands." You understood. There was something in your own muscles, a tightness that wouldn't leave, a memory of how it felt to hold your breath for hours, to move without thought, to prepare to kill without ever having been taught how. The villagers avoided speaking about it. No one used the word Viking. No one asked where they had gone, as if silence itself might hold the raiders at bay a little longer. But the signs remained. Burnt fence posts, flattened grass where boots had trampled, the tree at the edge of the creek where someone had left a carving, not of words but of a spiral etched deep into the bark. You didn't know what it meant, but it hadn't been there 2 days ago. You found yourself circling the village perimeter like a dog checking for holes in the fence. It wasn't fear that made you walk. It was responsibility. The boy with the broomstick followed you for a time, dragging the wooden stick behind him like a tail. He didn't speak, but you felt his eyes on your back, waiting to learn something you didn't know how to teach. At the old well you paused. The bucket was missing, probably taken by someone in the panic, but there was water still, cold, still. You cupped your hands and drank slowly. That's when you heard it, a low, uneven rhythm. Not footsteps, not hooves, something softer. You turned and saw her, a woman barefoot and alone coming from the direction of the woods. Her hair was matted, her dress torn, and across her face ran a streak of dried blood. But she didn't look afraid, just exhausted. Behind her, limping slightly, came a child. They didn't speak, didn't explain. They just walked into the village like people returning from a long absence. You stepped forward to help, but the woman shook her head and kept walking until she reached the chapel steps. There she collapsed into the dust. Not from injury, just release. Others gathered slowly. No one asked where she had been. No one questioned whether she was one of them. They simply made space. By noon, 5 more came, one carrying a broken axe handle, one clutching a sack of potatoes as if it were gold, a teenager with a bandaged leg, an old man with only one shoe. The village, it seemed, had not been as empty as you thought. Some had stayed hidden in the forest, watching from shadows, waiting for silence. Now they returned, ghosts made flesh again. You helped dig a new fire pit near the center of the square. No one suggested rebuilding the granary yet. It was too soon. Instead, people brought whatever could burn: broken chairs, fence rails, even the scarecrow's pole. The flames crackled high as the light faded. You sat nearby, legs stretched out, hoe across your knees once more. The boy finally spoke. "What happens now?" You didn't answer right away. Instead, you looked around at the faces, older, quieter than they had been. Some were marked with soot, others with the kind of lines that fear draws when it stays too long. The priest stepped forward and placed a bundle of herbs into the fire. A sharp, minty scent rose with the smoke, cleansing in a way that words couldn't manage. You said, "Finally we plant." The boy frowned. "Now," you nodded. "Not for now, for after." That night, as the fire dimmed and the stars returned, you found yourself staring not at the sky, but at the dirt beneath your boots. You scratched at the ground with the tip of your hoe and found to your surprise a sprout. Tiny, fragile, but real. It wasn't yours, probably blown in by wind or dropped by bird, but it had rooted anyway, and that, like so much else, felt like a sign worth believing in. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the village returned, not with celebration, but with silence. Every task was quieter than it had been before. The chickens clucked less. The dogs barked with more hesitation, as if the world had taught them to speak softly. Even the children played without laughter, their games slower, as if time had changed shape. You spent your mornings in the fields again, not to reap or plow, but simply to walk, to press your feet into the earth, to feel the ground settle under you, remembering. The barley that had not been trampled swayed in its gentle way, nodding each time the wind passed through. You didn't speak to it, but you understood it now, better than before. At midday, the blacksmith hammered in rhythm again, not armor, not weapons, just hinges, pots, and tools. But the ring of iron felt different now, sharper, more awake, as if every strike echoed with what had not happened, with what might still. People began to rebuild slowly, not walls, not yet. They fixed shutters, patched roofs, gathered stones, but no one rebuilt the granary. It remained a blackened skeleton at the edge of the village, untouched, a memory preserved in ash. The widow who had poured pitch on the chapel roof sat most days outside her home, weaving strips of cloth into rope. She didn't speak much, but when the younger women passed, they stopped and helped without asking. The rope grew longer each day. None of you knew what it was for. That didn't seem to matter. One morning you heard hooves. Not many, just 2 or 3. They were slow, cautious. Not the gallop of soldiers or the thunder of raiders. You stepped to the path with your hoe in hand, not ready to use it, but not willing to drop it either. A rider emerged from the tree line, cloaked, hooded, with a banner you didn't recognize, a faded green cloth stitched with a pale blue knot. Behind him, a second rider led a mule carrying bundles. You waited. He dismounted without command. His boots were muddy. His beard was gray, neatly trimmed, his face tired. "I heard," he said quietly, "that something happened here." You didn't reply, just nodded. "I came to see who was left." Still you said nothing. He looked past you at the burnt granary, the quiet homes, the chapel. Then he met your eyes. You stayed. You didn't nod this time. You simply looked back. The rider glanced toward his companion, who stepped forward and opened a bundle: salted fish, dried herbs, linen, and something else. Nails, tools, a rolled parchment. "Tribute," the older man said. "From the western hill villages. We've seen ships too. You're not alone." You felt your shoulders shift, not rise, not fall, just loosen slightly. He didn't stay long. Just enough to leave the mule, enough to shake the blacksmith's hand, enough to speak to the priest. Before he rode off, he turned to you again. "The raiders won't forget this place." You met his gaze. "Neither will we." And then he was gone. That evening, the boy with the broomstick, who no longer carried it, sat beside you on the chapel steps. "Do you think they'll come back?" he asked. You watched the sky. A single bird traced a slow arc over the fields. "Maybe," you said, "but we'll still be here." He nodded, and for the first time since the raid, you saw something flicker in him. Not defiance, not strength, something smaller but steadier. He stood and walked off, not to hide, but to work. He began helping the potter stack firewood without being asked. The stars came clear again that night, scattered like seeds across velvet. You sat in the square, surrounded by faces that had changed but stayed. No one asked for stories. No one demanded anything from anyone. The priest lit a lantern and hung it from a pole at the edge of the field, a small light swinging gently in the night wind. You didn't know why he did it, but it felt right, a marker, a sign, a way to say, "We are still here." And perhaps that was all that needed saying. Not victory, not vengeance, just presence. Tomorrow you would plant. Not because it was safe, not because the danger was gone, but because you had to. Because the earth had waited. Because your hands still remembered how. Because this was your home. And the world, no matter how wild, would have to learn that. The morning of planting came with a pale light, and the steady sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate quiet in their intention. You rose before the bell rang, long before the birds found their voice again. There was something sacred about that hour, when the sky was not yet blue, but no longer black, when the world seemed unsure whether to wake or remain dreaming. You walked to the field with your hoe slung over your shoulder, its worn handle familiar now, not just as a tool, but as an extension of memory. Behind you came others, the boy, the blacksmith, the widow, the potter's daughter, a few more who had returned from the woods after the raid. No one had spoken of their hiding places, and no one asked. What mattered now was only this, that they had come back to the soil. The ground was softer than expected, the rains of the past days having loosened the earth. You knelt and placed your hand against it, feeling the cold damp seep into your palm. The dirt clung to your skin like it belonged there, like it knew you. One by one the others did the same. No ceremony, no blessing. Just the sound of hands pressing into the soil, drawing lines, dropping seeds, covering them again. A rhythm older than war, older than fear, a rhythm the earth never forgot. The boy worked beside you, his fingers clumsy at first but eager. You didn't correct him. There would be time for that later. For now his presence was enough. Mid-morning came with a light mist that hung above the barley, catching the sun and turning it silver. The fields shimmered like they were holding their breath. A few birds returned, cautious sparrows testing the silence. Somewhere nearby, a rooster crowed for the second time. It sounded tired but determined. The blacksmith paused to wipe his brow and muttered, "Never thought I'd miss the sound of that damn bird." You smiled but didn't reply. Your hands were deep in the soil again, your eyes tracing the row ahead. By midday, the village square was no longer quiet. Children had begun to chase each other again, not loudly, not with wild joy, but with that soft energy of those who know they are watched and may be protected. Someone had set out apples from a cellar stash, and the scent of fruit and smoke and sweat filled the air. You stood to stretch your back and looked around. It was no longer the same village. Not really. The scars were visible: blackened wood, missing shutters, patches of roof repaired with cloth and rope. But in those imperfections, there was something else. A resilience that hadn't been there before, a quiet agreement. We remain. Near the edge of the field, the widow had begun marking stones, not graves, not names, just lines carved into flat rock. One for each home, one for each family that had stayed. It wasn't a memorial. It was a map, a way to say here and here and here we are alive. Later that afternoon, a girl found a broken helmet in the stream, half buried in mud. She carried it to the square, holding it with 2 fingers, like a dead thing. The boy took it from her and placed it on a stump near the fire pit. No one moved to remove it. It stayed there for days, weathered, emptied, a reminder that even iron can be left behind. At dusk you stood at the chapel's edge and watched the horizon. No ships, no sails, just the long shadows of trees stretching westward like fingers, searching for something they had lost. The priest joined you. "They'll tell stories," he said, "of how you stood alone." You shook your head. "I wasn't alone," you said quietly. "No," he agreed, "but you were the first to stop walking away." You didn't know how to answer that. Instead, you turned back to the field, where the first green shoots had begun to push through. Small, fragile, stubborn things. They didn't care who had come or gone. They only reached for the sun. That night, as the stars rose once more and the lantern was lit at the edge of the path, you sat beside the fire and listened not to voices, but to the sound of breathing. The soft rustle of blankets, the sigh of someone settling into sleep, the creak of old wood. And for the first time in days you allowed yourself to close your eyes. The earth was turning again. The danger was not gone, but neither were you. And tomorrow you would rise again. To plant, to mend, to remember, to remain. The rains came 2 days later, soft at first, a drizzle that clung to hair and brows like mist, then heavier, pressing into the roofs and paths until the ground drank greedily. No one complained. Rain was not an enemy. Rain was a witness and a healer. You stood under the thatch overhang of your home, arms folded, watching the droplets bounce off the wooden rail. Behind you, the boy was asleep on a pile of old cloth, one arm hanging over the edge as if reaching into some dream beyond his years. You didn't wake him. He'd worked beside you all morning steady and silent, and now his breath came in deep, heavy waves. You remembered sleeping like that before the world asked too much. Outside, the blacksmith was dragging a cart under the eaves of the chapel, protecting what few tools remained from the downpour. The widow crossed the square with a bucket in each hand, filling them from a run-off trench she had dug herself. Her sleeves were soaked to the elbows, but she didn't slow. No one slowed anymore. You stepped out into the rain. The first touch was cold, but it felt good. Honest. You let it run down your face into your beard across your shoulders. The earth beneath you turned slick, sucking at your boots. You moved carefully as you always did now, like someone aware of every step's weight. There was a rhythm in the rain, not just the patter, but the way it mixed with the distant creak of wood, the grunt of someone lifting a heavy beam, the soft cluck of a hen tucked beneath a crate. It was music if you listened the right way. Not a song, but a reminder. Everything moves forward, even after fire. At the edge of the square, someone had started repairing the bell frame. The post had cracked during the panic, not from violence, just from age and pressure. You joined without words, lifting the beam while the others wedged stone beneath it. The priest stood nearby, oiling the rope. He no longer wore his vestments, just a plain tunic patched and muddy. Later, as the rain softened again, you found yourself drawn back to the field. The barley was bent under the weight of the water, but it had not broken. You walked among the rows, feeling the stalks brush your knees, their touch like fingers seeking something. The soil squished beneath your step, but it held. In the center of the field stood the scarecrow, or what was left of it. Its head had slumped and one arm hung limp, the cloth tattered and dripping. But it still stood, somehow. You approached and reached out, lifting the arm back into place. With a bit of rope you tied it at the shoulder. Then you pressed the wooden spine deeper into the ground, anchoring it once more. From the corner of your eye you saw the boy watching. He didn't speak, just nodded. And then slowly he raised his own arms, mimicking the gesture, standing still among the barley. Rain ran down his cheeks, but he didn't blink. It was a game maybe, or a kind of tribute. You let him stay like that and turned back to the village. By evening the fire pit was lit again, smoke rising slowly into the gray sky. It didn't smell like fear anymore, just wood, earth, rain-damp clothes, and the scent of onions frying in a cracked iron pan. People gathered, close hands outstretched to the warmth. You sat cross-legged on the edge of the circle, your back resting against a stump. No one said much. A few children leaned into their mothers. The blacksmith passed around a cup of something sharp and hot. The potter hummed a tune half forgotten. Then, without asking, the priest stood and began to speak. Not a sermon, not a prayer. Just a story from years before about a traveler who had once come through your village with nothing but a broken wheel and a song about geese that danced in the snow. It was a foolish story. Gentle. It made no sense. But it made people smile. You watched the boy laugh just once, a short exhale that broke into something real, and you felt something soften in your chest. You looked up at the stars just beginning to show themselves behind the thinning clouds. The rain had stopped. Tomorrow there would be more work. The barn still needed mending. The stream was rising. There were rumors from the south, more ships, more strangers. But for now there was this, a circle of light in the middle of a quiet world. You closed your eyes, and for the first time in many nights you dreamed of nothing, just the sound of the rain returning to the earth. The morning mist lifted like a veil, revealing a village that looked almost untouched if you didn't know where to look. From a distance the thatched roof sat in neat rows, the fields stretched in calm gold, and the smoke from the breakfast fires rose slowly into the pale sky. But up close the scars were everywhere. A patch of scorched earth near the granary, a fence line rebuilt with mismatched wood, a door that no longer closed all the way. You rose before the others and walked the perimeter again. It had become a habit, not out of fear but something deeper, vigilance born from gratitude. You knew now how quickly stillness could shatter. Past the well you found the girl with the braid, the one who had rescued the broken helmet. She was stacking stones in a spiral near the chapel. Not a grave, not a wall. Just a shape built slowly, deliberately, as if drawing something from memory. You didn't ask what it meant. She wouldn't have answered anyway. Instead you knelt and added a stone. She didn't stop you. From behind the chapel came the sound of hammering, not the sharp clang of the forge, but the softer, slower rhythm of someone building something small. You followed it and found the blacksmith kneeling beside a low table. He was crafting a rack from broken chair legs and scrap nails, muttering to himself with quiet concentration. "For what you asked." He didn't look up. "Tools." You waited. "We need order," he added after a moment. "A place for things." You nodded, then reached for a beam and helped him brace the frame. Later, when the sun climbed higher and the air thickened with the scent of damp straw and morning bread, you found yourself drawn once again to the river. The path there had changed. The brush that had once hidden it had been trampled, the reeds pulled back by boots now long gone. The water moved slowly, lazy in its motion, as if even the current had tired of carrying fear. You sat on the bank legs, folded hands resting on your knees, and waited. For nothing in particular, just for the sound of your own breath. You noticed how the mud near the edge still bore prints not fresh but not yet erased. Deep toe marks from hurried feet. One set smaller than the rest. You ran your finger along the indentation, wondering which child had paused here, wondering if they had looked back. Beside the water, half buried in silt, you saw something glint. You leaned forward and uncovered it gently, a small brooch in the shape of a bird, rusted at the edges but still intact. Not from the village. Not English. You turned it over in your palm. It was cold and heavy for its size, the metal darkened by the river. You didn't know the symbol, but it had been worn by someone who had stood here before you. Someone who had stepped ashore and perhaps hesitated. You pocketed it. Not as a trophy, as a memory. By the time you returned to the village, the children were playing again. Their game was strange, half chase, half ritual, but it had rhythm. One would touch a tree spin twice, then shout a word no one else understood. The others would scatter and laugh. You didn't ask what it meant. Sometimes meaning comes later. You helped the potter repair a cracked jug that afternoon. The clay had warped from fire and cold. You held the base while she poured in the binding, both of you working in silence. When she finished, she looked at you and said simply, "It will hold." It was the first full sentence she'd spoken in days, and it was enough. That night, the priest lit 3 lanterns instead of 1. He hung them at the corners of the square, their light casting long triangles into the darkness. The flame danced inside each glass globe like a captured spirit, warm and wavering. No one questioned it. No one needed to. As the stars returned brighter, now clearer than the nights before, you sat beside the fire once more, the boy curled next to you, his shoulder pressed against yours in silent trust. The helmet still sat on the stump nearby, catching the glow like a hollow eye. The field beyond swayed gently. The world, broken though it was, had not ended. It had only changed shape, and in its new form you remained. The wind changed. You felt it before you saw it. The subtle shift in the way the barley bent, the cooler breath that drifted across your cheek before dawn had properly colored the sky. It carried with it the scent of far-off heather, river silt, and something else. Something unfamiliar, like iron soaked in brine. You didn't move at first. Just stood in the field, watching the stalks ripple in slow, measured waves. The mist curled tighter around your ankles than usual, reluctant to rise. The crows returned that morning too, but not to perch. They circled as if waiting for the wrong moment to begin again. You walked back to the village. The boy met you at the gate. He didn't speak, but his face had already read yours. He stood beside you, barefoot and alert, staring out across the fields as if waiting for something to crest the horizon. But nothing came. Not yet. That day you checked everything. The paths, the fences, the chapel roof, the stream's edge. Nothing was broken. No footprints, no burned branches. But still you felt it, the breath of something watching. You weren't alone in it. The blacksmith came to you midday. He wiped his hands on his apron, smearing rust into the cloth. I sharpened everything he said, even what shouldn't be sharpened. You nodded, then asked, "Do you feel it?" He didn't answer, just looked out toward the hills. The wind shifted again. The potter left her wheel untouched for the first time in weeks. She stood at the edge of the chapel steps, clay drying on her wrists, staring toward the trees. The children no longer played chase. Their feet scuffed the dirt with quiet, uncertain arcs. Even the dog stayed low to the ground. But no one spoke of it. The fear now was different. Not the loud, flailing panic of the raid. This was quiet, slow, like water seeping into a foundation you thought was strong. That night the priest didn't light the lanterns. When you asked him why, he said, "Light draws eyes." So you all sat in darkness. The fire was doused early. Doors were closed. The square was quiet. Not dead, just bracing. You slept beside your door-hoe across your knees again. The boy slept inside, curled beneath the cloak you'd once worn as a young man. The stars above remained cold and distant. When dawn returned, the mist was thicker than it had been in months. You couldn't see past the chapel from your doorway. The world had shrunk to silence. Then a sound. A single knock. Not on your door. On the chapel. 3 raps, steady, calm. You stood. Others heard it too. Figures began to emerge wrapped in shawls and coats, faces pale but steady. The blacksmith stepped beside you, holding a hammer without swinging it. You approached together. The door creaked open, and there he was. The young Viking, the one who had knelt in the grass weeks ago, the one who had pointed toward the river and then vanished into the trees like a ghost who regretted ever becoming flesh. His face was gaunter now, hollow-cheeked, his cloak torn, blood crusted around his temple. He didn't raise his hands this time. He simply collapsed. You caught him before he hit the stones. There was no fight in him, no anger, just exhaustion. His breath came in shallow bursts, and his eyes fluttered like candles in wind. You carried him inside, laid him near the altar, and lit a single candle. Enough to see his face, not enough to draw attention. The priest returned with bandages. The potter brought hot broth. The blacksmith paced near the door like a tethered bear. When the boy saw the wounded stranger, he whispered, "It's him." You nodded. No one asked why he was back. They only tended to his wounds. Through the day he slept, muttered, shivered. When he finally opened his eyes, he looked at you first. He spoke in his language, words like river stones, rough and fast. You didn't understand, but he kept repeating one sound: fear, fire. You leaned closer. He pointed toward the woods, then mimed smoke. Then he whispered, "Coming." The priest translated the rest with broken phrases. The boy had picked up a few words too. The message was clear. More were coming, not like before. Worse, not raiders, not scouts, a warband. And they weren't days away. They were here. Tomorrow. That night no one slept. Not really. Some lay down for a time. Others stared into fires that had not been lit. You sat near the chapel steps, the boy curled beside you with his head on your knee. He was awake but said nothing. His fingers kept tracing circles into the dirt, one after another, never finishing them. The young Viking slept inside, breathing shallow, his wound bound but not healed. The blacksmith kept watch at the door, hammer in hand. The priest stood by the window, whispering to himself in the rhythm of half-prayers and forgotten lullabies. You weren't afraid. Not like before. This was something else, heavier, quieter. A weight you carried in your chest like a stone. Dawn crept in without color. The sky stayed gray, not with clouds, but with waiting. Fog lay flat on the fields. Nothing moved. The barley didn't sway. The birds stayed still. You stood before anyone else and walked the perimeter, past the granary ruins, past the creek where the girl's spiral of stones had grown another ring overnight. The world was holding its breath. At the southern path, the one that led toward the hills and river beyond, you saw it. A single raven perched on the branch of a dead tree, not moving, not calling, just watching. You watched back, then turned and walked slowly toward the square. They had already begun to gather. No one needed to be called. They just came. The blacksmith, the potter, the widow, the priest, the girl with the braid, the boy, a few others. Those who had fled before those who had stayed. All quiet, all waiting. You looked at them and felt the strange stillness of acceptance settle over the group like a shared cloak. There was no strategy, no plan, just a knowledge that whatever came now would be met together. "They're close," the priest said. You nodded. The blacksmith stepped forward, holding a blade he had shaped from broken iron and melted hinges. It was crude, but sharp. He handed it to you without a word. You looked at it, then down at your hoe. You kept the hoe. The blade, you planted it in the ground at the edge of the square, a marker, or a promise. Then you looked at the chapel. The young Viking was standing, swaying, one arm bandaged tight. He had tied a strip of cloth across his forehead and held nothing in his hands. He met your eyes and nodded. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. Just a moment shared between two men who had both seen the fire and still chose to face it. The first sign came not in sound, but in smell smoke, faint, sharp, wrong. Then slowly the sounds followed, leather creaking, branches breaking, steel brushing against steel. You walked to the edge of the field and waited. They emerged from the mist like a memory sharpened into nightmare. Taller, broader, armed not with axes alone, but with shields, mail torches. They moved in lines, organized, disciplined. This was no raid. This was conquest. There were more than before, twice as many, perhaps more. Their boots pressed into the earth without hesitation. Their eyes didn't search, they knew where they were going. You didn't speak. You stepped forward, alone. Your hoe rested across your back, your hands empty. You didn't raise them, you didn't bow. You simply stood. Behind you the village remained still. 1 step. 2. They stopped. A man with a gold-threaded cloak and a sword at his hip stepped forward from their line. His beard was braided, his mouth curled into something that might have once been a smile. He raised a hand, not to strike, to speak. He barked something in his tongue. The young Viking limped forward. He stood beside you, wobbling but upright. He answered in the same language, quietly, flatly. The other man's face changed. Not rage, not confusion. Recognition. They exchanged a few words more. Then silence. The leader stepped forward again. Closer. You didn't flinch. His hand moved toward his sword. Your grip tightened not on a weapon but on stillness itself. Then a sound. From behind you, a crack of wood. Then another. The villagers emerged. Not in formation, not in fury, in stillness, in presence. The widow with her hands empty, the potter with a broken shard, the boy barefoot holding nothing at all. Dozens of them. Not armed, not armored. Just standing, unmoving, unwilling. The Viking leader looked past you. At them. Then at the field. Then at the smoldering granary. Then at the child's spiral of stones. And for a long time nothing happened. Then he spoke once more. Low, short, final. Turned, walked back into the mist. His men followed, not slowly, not quickly, just away. You stood for a long time, then sat, then exhaled. Not relief, just breath. And behind you the village began to breathe again too. They were gone, not in haste, not in shame, but with the quiet, precise movements of people who had measured what stood before them and decided it was not worth the blood it would cost. The mist swallowed their shapes quickly, and with it the fear that had hovered like a hawk above every rooftop. You didn't move for a while, none of you did. The earth beneath your feet held still. No tremble, no echo, just the damp solidity of ground that had seen too much and still offered itself. The boy was the first to break the silence. He stepped beside you and slipped his hand into yours, not for protection, just to be sure you were real. You gave his fingers a soft squeeze, and then stood, knees creaking louder than you wanted to admit. The rest of the village didn't cheer. No one shouted or clapped. Instead, people returned slowly to their places, not out of habit, but as if returning to themselves. The widow wiped her palms on her apron and walked back to her ropework. The potter returned to her wheel and turned it without clay, just listening to the rhythm. The blacksmith sat down on a low stool and stared at his hands for a long time, his fingers twitching with energy he couldn't yet place. The priest relit the chapel lantern. And the young Viking, the boy who had warned you, who had once arrived as part of the fear, sat on the chapel steps and closed his eyes. He didn't sleep. He just rested. Not as a stranger, but as someone who had finally put something down. You walked to the field again. The barley had grown another inch. You noticed it right away, a line of green stretching against the horizon, delicate and defiant. Birds were landing in the rows, now hopping between stalks, pecking gently at what had sprouted. You crouched and pressed your palm to the dirt. Still warm, still living. You whispered a thank you, not to anyone in particular, just to the moment. When you stood again, the girl with the braid was walking toward you, holding something in her hands. A small bundle wrapped in linen. She passed it to you without a word. Inside were sprouting seeds fresh gathered from the northern slope, where the soil stayed cooler and the wind was kind. You looked at her. She nodded. You began planting again that afternoon, not because the threat was gone forever, but because this was the right thing to do, the necessary thing. The boy worked beside you, sleeves rolled, face streaked with old tears and new resolve. Each handful of earth felt different now, not heavy but sacred. By evening, more had joined. The priest dug with his bare hands. The potter used the flat of her palm to press seeds down gently. The blacksmith laid a row of broken nails in a crescent at the edge of the new plot, a quiet blessing of metal and memory. Dinner was quiet that night. Bread dipped in oil, some old carrots boiled until sweet, and a pot of herbs from the chapel garden. You all ate around the fire, no longer at the edges, but together, shoulders touching, eyes soft. The boy leaned his head against your arm and asked, "Will they come again?" You didn't answer at first. Then you said maybe. He didn't frown, he didn't shrink. He just nodded and passed you a piece of bread. The young Viking sat apart from the group, but not far. He was whittling something, a small figure, maybe an animal. You couldn't tell yet, but the way his hands moved, it was with care. Not the hands of a raider, not anymore. Later that night, as the stars returned, someone began to hum. Not a song anyone recognized, just a tune, soft and slow, rising like steam from the fire's edge. Others joined in. A single note here, a harmony there. The fire crackled between you and the sky bent down to listen. You closed your eyes, not to sleep, just to feel the night hold you. And in that moment no one was a farmer or a blacksmith or a priest or a child of raiders. You were only people who had stayed, and planted, and endured. The season turned. It didn't announce itself with thunder or storms, just a shift in the way the wind moved through the trees, a new rhythm in the creak of the well. the crisp snap of leaves beneath boots in the morning. The air grew thinner, cooler. The barley deepened in color. What had once been pale green now leaned golden, heavy-headed, almost ready. You woke earlier now, before even the first birds. It had become a habit, not from fear, but from rhythm, a pattern your body trusted. You would sit on the chapel steps, mug of lukewarm water in hand, watching the mist rise from the fields like breath from the mouth of the earth. The boy sat beside you most mornings now, still half asleep, chin resting on his knees. He didn't speak much anymore. He didn't need to. His presence was a language you understood, one of staying, of being, of growing roots. The young Viking remained, though he rarely left the shadow of the chapel. He'd begun carving more often shapes, now more recognizable: a bird, a fish, a small figure of a man with one hand raised. The children started leaving little things beside his carvings: feathers, smooth stones, half-eaten apples. No one told them to. No one explained. You didn't ask him if he planned to leave. He didn't ask if he could stay. Both of you understood that some questions are only ever answered by time. One day, while digging the outer rows, your hoe struck something hard. You crouched, brushing the soil away with careful fingers, until it revealed itself a buckle. Tarnished, rusted, still attached to a strip of leather that had long since dried into the earth. You pulled gently and uncovered more: the faint curve of a helm, a rib of iron. A body, old, years buried, forgotten. You didn't call the others right away. You sat beside it for a time. The wind moved the barley softly. The earth around you held its breath. It wasn't one of yours. No bones had been buried in the field since before your grandfather's time, and even then graves were made with stones and markings. This one had been left behind. You did not feel fear. You felt responsibility. You called the priest and the blacksmith. Together you unearthed the rest, carefully, silently. It was a warrior, perhaps, or a thief, or just a man who had died too far from home to be remembered. You wrapped what was left in linen, laid it near the chapel beneath the tree with the split trunk. The young Viking carved a flat stone and placed it at the head, though he carved no name. That evening the potter lit a small bowl of oil and left it at the base. No one said his name. No one needed to. He had been seen. That night sleep came easier. For all of you. In the following days the village began to shift again. The granary was rebuilt, not grand, not tall, but strong. The beams were reinforced with iron bands from the forge. The roof was covered in moss-thick thatch. You helped carry the stones. The boy mixed the mud. The blacksmith drove the nails with careful hands. People began drawing marks on the doors again, protective symbols, old charms, handprints in ash. The chapel bell rang twice that week, once for a birth, once for the arrival of 3 strangers seeking rest and work. You offered them water bread and silence. They stayed. The fields filled with color. Not just the barley, but rows of beans roots, herbs and wildflowers someone had scattered along the edges. The bees returned in slow hums. The frogs sang at dusk. The world, it seemed, had begun to trust itself again. You still walked the perimeter, still listened to the wind, still felt the earth beneath your boots each morning. But now, when you stopped at the edge of the field and looked out toward the river, you no longer searched for sails. You searched for light, and sometimes you saw it. A glint on the water, a flicker in the trees. The sky had shifted. But so had you. Harvest came not with ceremony, but with hands, dozens of them blistered and calloused, moving in rhythm through the fields. The stalks bowed easily beneath your blades, golden and ripe, their soft rustling the only music you needed. The boy worked beside you, his motions slow but certain. He no longer asked what to do. He just watched you, mirrored you, and then did it better. You moved row by row, line by line, until the field became a memory beneath your feet, just stubble and soft dirt, and the scent of barley hanging heavy in the air. By mid-morning, sweat clung to your skin, and your back ached in the way that reminded you you were still alive. The others worked in their own corners of the field. The potter with her sleeves rolled high, gathering bundles into woven baskets. The widow had organized a line for passing sheaves hand to hand, her voice sharp, efficient, but kind. Even the priest's robes tied above his knees moved through the barley like a man who had remembered what it was to bend with the wind rather than speak against it. The young Viking worked too. Silently, always a little apart but never out of reach. He didn't try to lead or linger. He just moved from task to task with a quiet awareness, as if he was trying to repair something only he could see. At midday, you sat under the large elm at the edge of the field. The sun filtered through the leaves in soft patterns, dappling the ground like spilled gold. The boy flopped beside you, hair matted with sweat and dust. He didn't speak. just stared at the sky with a half-smile on his lips. "I hate barley," he muttered after a while. You chuckled low and quiet. "You only hate it when you're tired." He didn't argue. A few of the women brought bread and salted fish from the stream's traps. It wasn't much, but no one expected more. The food passed from hand to hand with little ceremony. There were no blessings spoken aloud, just nods, just thanks. After the meal you rose again. Your legs protested, your arms ached, but the work wasn't done. It never really was. The final row took you until dusk. The sun dipped low behind the treetops, painting everything in long shadows and golden breath. The field was quiet again, cleared, resting. The baskets sat in stacks, ready to be carried into the new granary. You stood for a while at the center of what had been, your boots pressed deep into the earth, your hands hanging by your sides, empty now. The wind picked up slightly, ruffling your shirt, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. The crows returned, just a few, and circled once before settling onto the scarecrow's arms as if offering it company. You turned back toward the village. Lanterns had been lit. Their soft glow wavered between homes, swaying like stars on strings. The chapel bell had not rung that day. It didn't need to. The rhythm of the harvest was enough. In the square, someone had started humming. You didn't know the tune, but it pulled at something old inside you, something from before the raids, before the wariness. A lullaby, perhaps. Or a planting song your mother once sang when your hands were still too small to hold a tool. You sat near the fire pit and closed your eyes for a moment. When you opened them, the young Viking was there. He sat across from you, legs folded, hands resting on his knees. He held nothing, said nothing. But in the firelight you could see that he had carved something new. He reached out slowly and placed it near the hearth between you. A small figure, rough, angular, of a man with a hoe slung over his shoulder head, slightly bowed eyes carved shut. You looked at it for a long time, then back at him, and for the first time he smiled. Just a little. The boy leaned over to see it, then whispered, "It's you." You didn't answer. You didn't have to. Later, as the stars unfolded across the sky and the village settled into sleep, you sat beside the statue and the fire, letting the night press gently against your skin. And in that stillness, with the harvest complete and the world no longer holding its breath, you finally allowed yourself to breathe, not just for survival, but for joy. Because in this quiet something had taken root. Not just grain, but the beginning of peace. The frost came earlier than expected. One morning you stepped outside and the world had turned silver. Every blade of grass, every thatched roof, every wooden beam shimmered with a thin, quiet layer of ice. It hadn't snowed, not yet, but the cold had finally taken its place among you, not as a storm, but as a soft and patient guest. Your breath curled into the air as you crossed the square. It lingered longer now, hanging near your face as if reluctant to leave. The chapel bell hadn't rung in a week. The priest had taken to writing instead, pages and pages of small, careful notes. No one asked what he was recording. You imagined it was something like memory or warning. Inside the granary the air was thick with the scent of stored grain, dry, dense, comforting. Rows of baskets lined the walls, each carefully marked with twine and color. The boy had taken to organizing them by size and fullness, a system only he understood, but one that worked. You found him there now, sitting cross-legged on a crate, counting aloud in a whisper. 73, 74, he murmured, then paused, looked up. "Do you think we have enough?" You didn't answer right away. You knelt beside him, picked up a handful of barley and let it slip through your fingers. The kernels clicked gently like rain on a hollow roof. "Enough for what you asked," he shrugged. "The winter, the ones who might come, the next time." You nodded slowly. Maybe, maybe not. He was quiet a long moment, then whispered, "Then we'll plant again." You smiled. Yes, you would. That afternoon, the first snow arrived, not in drifts, but in scattered flurries, drifting down from a pale sky like dust from the shoulders of old gods. Children reached out to catch it. The potter watched it melt in her hair. The blacksmith stood outside his forge with his arms crossed, watching it fall without saying a word. You walked to the riverbank. The water still flowed, but slower now, thicker, like it too was growing tired. Along the edge, small shards of ice clung to the reeds like teeth. You squatted near the edge and touched the water, cold enough to sting, but clean, still living. Across the river, the trees stood bare and sharp, a jagged line of bone against the sky. Somewhere beyond them, others might still be moving, preparing, planning. But you weren't afraid anymore. You were ready. You walked back slowly, letting your boots press into the first thin crust of snow. Your footprints left a trail that would disappear by morning. That too was okay. In the square, the girl with the braid had built a ring of stones near the fire pit. Inside it she placed bits of broken pottery and charred wood. A small shrine, maybe, or something else. The young Viking watched her from a distance, carving once more. His beard was thicker now, his shoulders broader. He hadn't spoken much since the harvest, but his presence had never faded. That night he brought a new carving to the chapel. It was larger than the others, nearly the length of a man's arm. It depicted a tree twisted and bare with deep roots and a hollow at its center. Within the hollow stood a figure not tall, not proud, but steady. You looked at it for a long time, then placed it at the center of the chapel floor. It belonged there. The priest nodded in approval, then returned to his writing. You sat beside the fire once more. The boy curled beneath a blanket, already half asleep. The snow whispered outside light against the windows. The wind had a new voice, softer but constant. You closed your eyes. In the stillness your thoughts drifted. To the first moment you saw the smoke. To the silent standoff in the mist. To the harvest. To the hands beside yours in the field. And now to winter. You weren't waiting anymore. You were living. Even in the cold the earth remained. Even in the silence hearts kept their rhythm. Even in the dark there was warmth. And in that warmth you knew. Whatever came next you would endure. Because you had chosen to stay. Because you had planted. Because you had remembered how to be still. And stillness now was no longer weakness. It was home. Winter deepened slowly, folding itself over the village like a wool blanket, heavy quiet full of invisible threads. The first true snow came in the second week of frost. It arrived at night soundless, and by dawn the world outside your door had turned white. Not bright, not clean. Just muffled, as if the earth had forgotten how to echo. You opened the door that morning and stepped out into the hush. The snow crunched beneath your boots, dry and thin, not yet deep enough to bury, but enough to soften everything it touched. The chapel roof sagged slightly under its weight. The granary doors creaked when you passed. The scarecrow wore a frozen shawl of ice along its shoulders, as if winter had claimed even it for its quiet army. Inside the homes, fires burned low. Not for celebration, for survival. The boy spent most of his time near the hearth, now curled under blankets, reading a book the priest had gifted him. He didn't speak much, but he'd started writing short phrases, half-stories scratched into bark or charcoal-smeared scraps of cloth. You didn't ask to read them, but he showed you one once. It said simply, he did not run. Outside the world slept, but life still moved slowly. The blacksmith worked shorter hours now, keeping the forge hot only long enough to mend what broke. The widow made candles from fat and bark, twisting wicks with cracked fingers. The potter dug clay from the frost-hardened edge of the river, her breath sharp and visible with each step. The young Viking stayed quiet. He spent most of his time rebuilding the wooden fence along the east perimeter, not because it needed it, but because it gave his hands something to do. His beard was longer now, almost hiding the scar near his jaw. He still wore the same boots from the day he arrived, but they were patched with cloth from the chapel's old curtain, a strange but fitting detail. Some days he walked beyond the river alone. You watched him from the tree line, wondering what he searched for or who. He always came back by dusk, eyes colder, breath heavier, but he came back, and that now was what mattered. One morning you found the boy standing near the scarecrow, arms folded tight, cheeks red from the wind. He wasn't playing, just watching the field. Snow had settled in the furrows, hiding the rows you had once planted, but he looked at it as if it still lived. "Will it grow again?" he asked. You didn't answer at first. You knelt beside him, scooped a handful of snow, and held it up so he could see the light pass through it. "It already is," you said. He didn't smile, but he didn't walk away either. That night a storm came louder than the ones before. The wind howled down from the hills, rattling shutters and dragging snow into corners. You sat by the fire, staring into the embers, while the boy slept with his hand curled around your wrist. In the middle of the night the bell rang once. A single chime. You stood quickly. The wind screamed when you opened the door, and the snow bit into your face like cold teeth. You crossed the square in long strides, boots sinking with each step. Others were emerging, too cloaked, silent, blinking into the dark. The priest stood beneath the chapel eaves, lantern raised high, his eyes wide, not afraid, alert. The bell had rung itself. You reached the rope. It hadn't moved. You stepped inside. The chapel was cold, the air dry and unmoving. Nothing out of place. No footprints. No shift in the light. Except for the carving. The one of the tree, the roots, the hollow, the man standing inside. It had cracked. A thin line ran through the trunk, splitting it clean down the middle, as if something had pressed against it from within. The young Viking entered behind you. His eyes went straight to the carving. He didn't speak, but you saw it in the way his jaw clenched. He knew what it meant. Something was changing. You didn't tell the others. Not yet. You simply returned to your place by the fire, sat down, and watched the snow slide against the door. And when the boy stirred and whispered, "Was it the wind?" you said, "Maybe." Because maybe was kinder than yes. But even then you knew. The winter was not just cold. It was a threshold, and something out there, or within, was waiting to cross it. The days shrank to whispers. Light came late and left early, slipping away like a guest too polite to say goodbye. You marked time now not by the sun but by firelight, when the hearth dimmed, when the oil ran low, when the last ember turned gray. Inside the chapel the carving remained cracked. No one touched it. No one tried to mend it. It sat in the center of the floor, a silent seam between what had been and what was becoming. Snow blew in through the eaves some nights, dusting the wooden boards around it in a thin crystalline veil. You often found the boy there, sitting cross-legged near its base, watching the shadow it cast. He no longer asked what it meant. Neither did you. Outside, the snow deepened. The path to the river vanished beneath drifts so thick they swallowed sound. The fence the Viking rebuilt disappeared entirely for a week. You all began walking in new lines, learning the village by memory instead of sight. One morning while gathering firewood, you found fresh tracks in the snow. Not boots. Bare feet. Wide-spaced, deep. Too deep for any of your own. You crouched, pressed your hand into the print. The cold bit your fingers, but you held them there, measuring, counting. Then followed the trail a short way. Heart-steady, breath slow. It led toward the river, then vanished at the tree line. You didn't follow it further, but you returned different. That night you spoke to the Viking. He listened, eyes sharp beneath the flickering lantern. You told him what you saw. He said one word. Skug. A shadow. Not a person, not a name. A thing. You didn't ask more. Because you'd seen it too, not in daylight but in dreams. Shapes moving between trees. Whispers that bent the wind in strange directions. Not threats, not yet, but something that watched. The boy had heard them as well. He told you one night, half asleep, that someone stood outside his window, that they hadn't knocked, that they had simply waited, then walked away. You asked what they looked like. He said like they were made of smoke. You didn't wake the village. You didn't ring the bell. But you began to carry your hoe again, even inside. The next day the potter found one of her bowls broken, not dropped, not cracked by cold. Split clean down the center. It sat on her windowsill, untouched by snow. She placed the pieces beneath the chapel carving beside the split trunk. The message was clear. Something had entered. That night the fire would not catch. You tried flint dry bark. Even oil, the flame sputtered and died again and again. The priest came and prayed beneath his breath. The blacksmith offered a coal from his forge. The flame lit, but only barely and only for a moment. You sat in the dark, not alone. The village did not panic. There were no screams, no mad scrambling, just silence, and a stillness deeper than before. When the fire finally caught just before dawn, the flame was blue. It stayed that way until morning. No one spoke of it, but everyone felt it. The wind had shifted, not outside, inside. The boy who never lied said, "I don't think they're coming. I think they're already here." And for once you did not disagree. You kept watch the next night, and the next. Each time at a different corner of the village. You walked in slow circles through snow and shadow, not searching but letting yourself be seen. Whatever watched you faced it. The third night you saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. Between two trees just beyond the old granary, a shape. Tall, thin, not moving, not breathing. You stepped toward it. It didn't flinch, but the snow beneath it never broke. You raised your hoe. And the figure turned, not to run, to vanish. Like steam and wind, you stood alone in the cold for a long while, watching the air settle again. You said nothing to the others. The next day the boy placed a stone on every doorstep. No one questioned him. Each stone was smooth, round, and marked with a single line across the center. The potter glazed hers in black. The priest anointed his with oil. You placed yours inside your hearth. It was not magic, but it was belief. And belief now was what you had left. Snowfall softened again in the days that followed, but the cold never left. It crept under doorways, curled beneath blankets, pressed itself into joints and thoughts. You moved slower now, not from weariness, but from understanding. Every gesture felt deliberate, every motion a choice. The world no longer rushed, it listened. The stones the boy had placed on the doorsteps remained. No one touched them. They became part of the landscape, like the wind-worn fences or the old stump where the blacksmith now sat during his breaks. When visitors came, two travelers from the east, cloaked and polite, they noticed the stones, paused, and asked nothing. That too felt right. You still walked the perimeter, though, less often, your breath steaming in short bursts. The trees stood like quiet sentinels, now bare and unshaking. Even the river moved differently. Not frozen, not flowing, but hovering as if uncertain about its place in this season. Inside the chapel, the cracked carving remained untouched. A thin layer of frost had begun to form along its edges, not from the air, but from within. You knew this, though you couldn't say why. It reminded you of wounds that don't bleed but burn. Some days you found the boy sitting beside it, whispering words you didn't know, maybe ones he'd written on scraps and then memorized. One morning he didn't wake, not at first. You found him curled beneath the blanket, his face pale, breath shallow. He opened his eyes when you touched his forehead. "It's cold inside," he said. You lifted him gently, wrapped him in every layer you could find, and carried him to the fire. The flames danced, but gave off little heat. The logs burned with strange colors, blue at the edges, green at the heart. The priest brought warm broth. The potter pressed her hands to the boy's feet. The blacksmith muttered something under his breath and left, returning with a glowing iron pulled straight from the forge. He placed it in a bucket beside the fire, and the warmth spread slowly, cautiously. The boy slept for a full day. When he awoke, his first words were they were walking through the field. You didn't ask who. You already knew. That night you did not sleep. You sat at the edge of the chapel near the stone ring the girl had built. She'd added new items lately: feathers, bits of coal, a cracked mirror, offerings, warnings. You weren't sure anymore. The wind shifted just before midnight. It no longer whispered. It hissed. You stood and stepped outside. Across the square near the old granary, the snow glowed faintly, not from moonlight, from within. You approached slowly, hoe in hand, eyes wide. The ground there had cracked, just slightly. Not from weight, from pressure, as if something underneath was beginning to rise. You touched the surface with your boot. It gave. Not deeply, but enough. The crack spiraled outward like a root system drawn in ice. You backed away. The priest had joined you, holding a lantern. He said, "It's not about keeping them out anymore." You nodded. "It's about holding the line." He didn't ask what that meant. You didn't explain. Because in some part of you, deeper than language, you understood this winter would not be survived with firewood and grain alone. The darkness pressing in now wasn't just cold. It was memory, grief, regret, and it had shape. In the morning, you found the boy placing a single object in the snow, the first carving the Viking had made, the one of you hoe slung over your back head, bowed. He didn't say why, but you left it there, because some things are meant to be seen by what waits. By dusk, the sky had turned a deeper gray. The air thickened with stillness. The trees no longer moved. And the wind no longer came from above. It rose from beneath. Something was coming. Not a raid, not an army, but a reckoning. And you who did not run would meet it. Not with blade, not with fear, but with presence. Because you remembered. Because you stayed. Because you planted. And now, because you would face whatever crossed that frozen line, not alone, but as the voice of soil and silence, and all things that do not yield. The village no longer made sound. Not from silence, but from reverence. The cold had deepened into something dense, like time made physical. Each breath you drew felt heavier than the one before, like you were pulling air from the bottom of a well. The fire burned, yes, but even it flickered with restraint now, as if it too feared drawing attention. The crack near the granary had spread. Overnight the snow around it had melted, revealing not earth, but stone, old, dark, veined with something that shimmered when the light hit it wrong. The boy touched it once and pulled back quickly. "It hums," he whispered, "but not with music." You hadn't let anyone near it since. Instead you walked. Each house, each face, a quiet inspection, not of readiness, but of resolve. No one said they were afraid, but no one asked when spring would come either. The priest continued to write. His hands shook more now, the ink frozen in the corners of his pages. You glanced once at what he had written. To witness the end is not failure. It is to confirm that something existed long enough to leave an echo. The blacksmith had stopped forging. He simply sat outside, now sharpening old tools one by one and setting them on a table as offerings. Some were rusted, some were chipped, none were meant for war, but still he sharpened them. The young Viking had carved something new. A door, just a door, no frame, no handle. It stood in the center of the chapel, upright, balanced by frozen earth and nothing else. When asked why, he said only, "So they know where to knock." You understood. It wasn't to keep something out. It was to tell the dark, you'll enter through us or not at all. That night the fire changed. It burned higher, not warmer, just taller. The color shifted, no longer blue, no longer orange, but something in between, like ash caught in amber. The wind didn't howl, didn't roar. It spoke, not in words, in rhythm, a slow, steady pulse that beat through your boots, into your legs, into your bones. You stood outside watching the granary. The crack had grown again. The stone shimmered now, even without light. Then movement. Not large, not sudden, just a flicker, like a shadow bending without anything to cast it. You stepped forward. The others gathered slowly. The boy stood beside you, holding the first carving in his hands again. His knuckles were white with cold, but he didn't tremble. The potter had drawn lines beneath her eyes in soot. She looked not like a woman, but like an ancestor come to watch. The priest carried nothing. He simply stood. The widow whispered something in a language none of you recognized, her hands folded tight to her chest. And the young Viking, he placed the door carving down on the snow and stepped back, eyes lowered. It came then, not as a shape, not as a scream, as stillness. A stillness so deep your ears rang from the absence. The snow around the crack rose, lifted, hovered, then fell, and at the center something emerged. Not a body, not a beast, a figure of shadow made from the absence of everything you understood. It moved without sound, without weight, and yet the ground bent beneath it. You stepped forward, hoe in hand. Not raised, just held. The boy placed the carving on the ground between you. The figure paused. You didn't speak. You simply knelt, placed your palm on the soil beneath the snow, and whispered, "This is not yours." The figure bent, not in violence, in listening. It stayed like that for a long moment, then straightened, then vanished. Not like smoke, like memory. The crack closed. The snow settled. The wind returned, and above you the first bird called, a single note, high, clear. The bird's cry lingered in the air long after the shadow had vanished. A thin, high sound, not triumphant, but trembling, like the voice of something that had forgotten how to speak and suddenly remembered. You stood in the snow hoe in hand, breath-shallow eyes fixed on the place where the figure had stood. The snow around the old crack had begun to melt. Steam rose in faint wisps curling upward into the morning air. Beneath it the earth was black and bare and soft, not burned, not broken, just awake. The boy reached down and picked up the carving he had placed between you and the shadow. Its surface was warm. You turned to the others, not with a speech or command, but with a look. It was done. For now. The priest closed his eyes and bowed his head. He whispered something too quiet to catch, but when he opened his eyes again, they no longer trembled. The blacksmith let out a long breath through his nose and wiped his palms on his apron, as if clearing them of something invisible. The potter knelt and scooped a handful of melted snow into her mouth. She grimaced, swallowed, then laughed. It was the first laughter you'd heard in days. You walked back toward the square with the boy at your side. The village had already begun to change. Not physically, the snow still blanketed every rooftop. The fences still leaned, the chapel still wore its frost like a crown of waiting, but the feeling had shifted. Something had passed through and chosen not to stay. And something older, something quiet and rooted had chosen to remain. Inside your home the fire had not gone out. It burned steady and warm, the logs popping now and then like tired applause. The boy curled up on the furs and fell asleep instantly. You sat near the hearth and watched him for a while. His face looked older in rest, shaped by everything he'd witnessed. You didn't know what he would remember, but you knew what he'd carry. That afternoon the snow turned to rain. Not hard, not heavy. Just a soft, steady drizzle that slid down the windows and melted the ice from the eaves. You stepped outside and watched it wash the village. The blacksmith stood bareheaded, letting it soak his beard. The potter danced in it, not a dance for anyone to see, just one for herself, arms slow and open. The priest rang the bell once, and its sound didn't feel like warning or mourning. It felt like breath. You walked to the field. The scarecrow stood still. Its shoulders had slumped from the weight of winter, and its cloth sleeves were ragged. You reached out and adjusted its posture, lifting one arm back into place. The snow beneath it had begun to retreat. You saw the tips of green beneath. Tiny, stubborn, alive. The boy joined you a while later. He didn't say anything, just stood beside you, watching the horizon. The wind had changed again, no longer carrying ice, but something damp and earthy like thawed roots and moss. He asked, "Will it come back?" You said maybe. He nodded. "Will we be ready?" You didn't answer, because readiness wasn't the point. But stillness was. That evening you returned to the chapel. The cracked carving had closed. You hadn't noticed it until you were nearly at its base. The split that had run through its center like a wound had sealed. Not perfectly. A faint line remained like a healed scar. But the wood no longer groaned. It no longer drew frost. The young Viking was there. He stood beside the carving, with his hand resting on its crown. His eyes didn't look at you, but past you to something distant you couldn't see. "I dreamt it," he said. You waited. "It came here because of me." You shook your head. "It came because we remembered something old." He nodded slowly as if accepting both truths. You reached out and touched the wood. Warm. Alive. That night the stars returned in full. Not behind clouds, not flickering, just there steady and clear like holes punched in the fabric of forgetting. The village slept, and for once it did not wait for danger. It simply rested, and the earth turned, and the frost began to let go. The thaw was not a sudden thing. It came slowly, as all honest things do. A drip from the eaves, a patch of earth at the edge of the chapel steps, the soft slush underfoot that replaced the dry crunch of snow. You woke one morning to the sound of water, not rain, not river, but melt, the sound of winter exhaling. You stepped outside and found the square shimmering with puddles, the snow receding like a tide. The granary roof dripped steadily, the buckets placed below already half full. The scarecrow, still standing sentinel, had begun to lean again, its frozen spine softening with the returning weight of the world. The boy was already up, boots sloshing as he walked the perimeter with arms out like wings. He wasn't playing. He was feeling, measuring the new space, the new air, the way the wind no longer pressed but passed. You watched him from the doorway, letting yourself stay still. He caught your eye, nodded, and continued his slow circling. That day the village opened every door. Windows, too. Even the chapel, long closed to keep in warmth, was unlatched to the sky. The air that entered was not warm, but it carried no threat. Only memory, only change. The priest read aloud for the first time since the night of the shadow. His voice was thin but certain, recounting old names from a ledger that had survived generations. Some were unfamiliar. Others were yours. He read them not like a list, but like a song. You stood outside, listening. The blacksmith dismantled the sharpened tool table piece by piece, not in haste but with care. Each blade was wrapped in cloth, oiled, and placed into a wooden box. Not forgotten, he said, just resting. The potter began molding again, not bowls but figures. Small ones, children holding hands, a crow perched on a crossbeam, a sleeping man with a crooked nose. She placed them on her windowsill without comment. And the young Viking, he sat in the center of the square, carving something you couldn't yet see. He didn't hide it. He didn't speak of it. He simply worked, every shaving of wood falling like slivers of silence around him. You returned to the field. The barley had not yet woken, but the soil had. You knelt, pressed your palm against the dark surface, and closed your eyes. No heat, no sound, but life, just below, just waiting. You walked the rose boots, sinking slightly now, the cold softening into something less cruel. By the fence post you found the spiral of stones the girl had laid. She had added to it a feather, a ring of rusted wire, a tiny bell. It jingled in the breeze no louder than breath. The boy joined you again. He crouched beside a patch of uncovered ground and began drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. Not letters, not symbols, just movement. You watched until he finished, then knelt beside him. "What is it?" you asked. "A gate," he said. You looked again. 4 lines, 2 vertical, 2 crossing, open at the bottom. "Where does it lead?" He shrugged. "Anywhere, as long as we walk through." That night the fire in your hearth burned steady in gold. No strange colors, no shifting shadows, just flame doing what flame is meant to do, warm flicker hold. The boy slept soundly, curled into the furs with his mouth slightly open, one hand resting on your knee. You didn't move it. You looked to the door. It was still shut, but you didn't check the lock. You didn't need to, because what had needed entry had already come and gone. And what remained now was only you, and the planting, and the waiting, and the turning of seasons, slow and full and merciful dot. The rains came not in violence but in rhythm, like fingers tapping gently on an old drum. They washed the village clean, one layer at a time. The soot that clung to the granary stones, the ash in the chapel gutters, even the last of the snowmelt that had hidden in corners, it all slipped away beneath the spring water's slow insistence. You stood in it without a cloak, letting it soak your shoulders and arms, letting it find your skin. The boy ran barefoot through the puddles, his laughter cutting the gray air like a bell that no longer feared being heard. He'd outgrown his boots over the winter. You had noticed, but said nothing. Let him feel the mud. Let him remember this. The spiral of stones near the chapel had grown into something more. A full circle now. Within it, the villagers had placed not just feathers and charms, but tools, a bent trowel, a bundle of twine, a clay shard with a thumbprint pressed into its surface. The potter called it the hearth outside the hearth. No one argued. The priest had stopped writing. Instead, he'd begun singing, low wavering tones in the old tongue without words, a sound that felt like the echo of a mountain, the cry of a bird whose name had been forgotten. He sang as he swept the chapel. He sang as he polished the bell. He sang as he walked to the field and stood at its edge. You joined him there. Together in silence you looked at the rows of dark fertile soil. It was ready. That afternoon the planting began. The village moved as one, not in haste but in flow. Baskets passed from hand to hand, seeds dropped like prayers into earth softened by water and memory. The blacksmith pushed his hands deep into the ground, burying more than seed. You watched him. He didn't look up, but his shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. The boy followed your every step. He carried a pouch of barley seeds tied to his hip. With each one he dropped, he whispered a name. Sometimes you caught it, the name of the scarecrow, or a bird or a dog that had disappeared in autumn. Other times you only saw his lips move. You said nothing. You knelt beside him and planted your own. By evening the rows were full, dark lines across a damp canvas. Nothing yet to see, everything already there. The young Viking stood at the center of the square, staring up at the sky. He had not helped with the planting, but no one questioned it. His role had shifted, not lesser, just different. He watched the clouds. He watched the wind. You had begun to believe he could feel what was coming long before it arrived. As dusk fell, he placed something new at the spiral of stones. A carving, tall and thin, a figure with no face standing between two gates, one open, one closed. You approached it as the first stars appeared. "What's on the other side?" you asked. He didn't answer, but he didn't walk away either. That night the rain stopped. The sky cleared. The stars came in waves, spilling across the heavens like fireflies uncorked from a jar. You sat on the chapel steps watching them shift and shimmer. The boy lay with his head in your lap, already half asleep, mumbling about constellations he was inventing as he spoke. You brushed the hair from his forehead and listened. To the silence, to the soil, to the sound of a village that no longer waited to be ruined, but waited instead to grow. You looked toward the granary, toward the chapel, toward the field that had once been burned, then frozen, then feared, and now ready. The wind moved softly through the barley stubble, and for the first time it carried no warning. Only invitation. You woke to birdsong. Not just one or two, but dozens, layered and overlapping like threads in a tapestry woven into the air between dawn and dew. Their cries rose from the trees, from the chapel roof, from the river's edge, and from the old fence that had once marked the village boundary, now barely visible beneath wildflowers and moss. The boy was already outside, arms stretched, face turned to the light. His hair had grown shaggy, and his feet were stained with soil. He looked like a creature born of the season itself, wild, quiet, and full of watching. You joined him near the field. The barley had begun to break through the dirt. Thin green lines no taller than your thumb reaching with stubborn insistence toward the sky. You knelt beside one, brushing snow-soft fingers over the first sprout. The boy asked, "Do you think they're the same seeds?" You looked up. He clarified, "The ones we planted before the shadow came." "Are they the same now?" You didn't know the answer, but you said they remember. That was enough. By midday the village was moving again, not rushing but rebuilding with the calm that comes after a long ache. The chapel had been scrubbed clean. The granary had been painted with streaks of ochre and clay. Someone had hung bells from the trees near the old river path, little ones made from broken spoons and rusted nails strung with thread and bone. They rang when the wind moved gently, not in alarm but in welcome. The blacksmith reopened his forge. The potter shaped bowls for spring broth. The widow, whose name had once been forgotten even by herself, now walked with the younger children, teaching them how to gather nettles without getting stung. And the Viking, who no longer stood apart, began carving benches. Long ones. For sitting. For meals. For things not yet planned. One afternoon he came to you with a gift. Not a carving. A gate. 2 posts, a crossbeam, no hinges, no fence. He planted it near the field's edge between the barley and the wild grass and carved a circle at its center. "This is where we stop waiting," he said. You nodded and stepped through. Later, as the sun slid down the sky like warm honey across old stone, the villagers gathered in the square. There had been no announcement, no bell. Just movement bodies drawn together by some quiet gravity, like they knew something needed to be marked. You stood with them, hands at your sides. The priest stepped forward holding a single page, one of the last he'd written. He read aloud. Not a sermon, not a decree, just a few lines. "We were not spared, we were not chosen, we remained, we held, and now we plant not from fear but from knowing." When he finished, he folded the page and let the wind take it. No one clapped, but no one left. Not for a long while. That evening you lit your fire with steady hands. The boy sat beside you the way he always had, only now a little taller, a little stronger. He leaned against you and asked, "When will we harvest?" You smiled. "When it's ready." He nodded and closed his eyes. And outside, beneath the stars, beneath the soil, beneath everything, the village dreamed not of what might come, but of what might grow. The summer returned in silence. It didn't arrive with the trumpets of warmth or the roar of storms, but with stillness like a hush falling over a sleeping child. The barley had grown tall again, waving in the wind with a quiet dignity. The sprouts had become blades, and the blades had thickened into stalks, heavy at the tips, nodding gently with the rhythm of the air. You rose early, as you always did, and walked the edge of the field. The soil was warm beneath your boots. The scent was familiar, damp, earthy, almost sweet, but it carried something new now. Not warning, not fatigue. Promise. Behind you the village had stretched into shape, not grown larger, just more itself. The new benches the Viking had built circled the fire pit now. The chapel doors no longer creaked. A new bell had been hung, forged by the blacksmith and tuned by the potter's ear. It rang at sunrise and once again at dusk. Not for prayer, for presence. The boy walked beside you, taller now, though he still favored the same oversized tunic cinched with rope. He pointed toward a section of the barley that bent too sharply. You nodded, and together you cleared the fallen stalks, tying them upright with bits of flax. "They're stronger in bundles," he said. You smiled. "So are we." By midday the air shimmered. The heat of the season had settled in, but it wasn't cruel. The rains had come and gone in time. The stream was still moving. The bees had returned, fat and slow, drifting from bloom to bloom like lazy patrols. You passed the spiral of stones again. It had grown wider still, filled with bits of charcoal-woven grass feathers and sun-bleached bone. The girl who had started it now tended it like a garden. She said nothing when you passed, just smiled, eyes clear, hands steady. The young Viking sat in the shade that afternoon, carving a new shape. It was unlike the others, not a person, not a creature, but a circle within a square with notches carved into the edges like steps. He placed it near the chapel, but said nothing of its meaning. The blacksmith nodded when he saw it. "It marks where the fire stood," he said, "where the world split and stayed." No one moved it. That evening the village gathered. Not for defense, not for mourning, for a meal. Bowls were filled with herbs and root vegetables. Clay pitchers passed from hand to hand, filled with something sweet and fermented. Children sat cross-legged. Elders leaned back on woven mats. You sat near the fire, the boy beside you, his eyes reflecting the light. The priest read from memory, not paper. "A year since we stayed," he said. "A year since the shadow came and asked, 'Will you remain?' And we said yes." A quiet ripple of breath moved through the group. The potter raised her bowl and said, "And we will say it again." The sound that followed wasn't applause. It wasn't cheer. It was breath, a collective exhale. The fire crackled and the wind turned cool. Above, the sky stretched wide and bruiseless. The stars blinked on one by one, like someone lighting candles across the ceiling of the world. You leaned back and let the warmth of the moment settle into your bones. This was not triumph. This was not ending. This was what came after. After fear, after winter, after the shadow. This was continuation. That night, as you walked the boy back to your home, he asked, "Do you think they'll remember this?" You stopped and looked down at him. "Who?" He shrugged. "The ones who come next. The ones who find the field, the carving, the door." You knelt, placed your hand on his shoulder. "If they listen," you said, "they'll hear it." "Hear what?" "The root beneath the root." He didn't ask again, and the wind carried no answer. Only the sound of growing things. The harvest came beneath a golden sky. Not the gold of kings or coin, but of sun and dust and time, that thick glowing light that settles over the world when it knows something is ending, and ending gently. The barley bowed in waves, not from wind, but from weight. You walked the field with the boy beside you, blades in hand, silence between you like a third companion. Every cut you made was slow, precise, careful. The stalks fell without protest, folding into the arms of the earth that had carried them this far. Behind you, baskets filled and passed between hands. No one hurried. No one needed to. This was the season of remembering. Each bundle laid in the granary was marked not with names, but with moments. The patch planted on the night of the frost. The row dug after the last shadow vanished. The cluster grown from the seeds the boy had whispered to. Each one placed as if tucking in a child. The girl with the braid added a final stone to the spiral that morning. At its center she placed a broken shard of the first blade the blacksmith had ever forged, cracked, worn, and useless as a weapon, but shining now like something sacred. Around it she pressed dried barley husks into the shape of a circle. No one touched it. It would stay there long after you were gone. As the day deepened, shadows stretched across the square. The chapel bells rang once, not a summons but an invitation. You all gathered without being called. There was no feast, just bread and water and a thin broth of herbs and salt. But the way you passed it, the way you received it, it felt like more. The priest, older now in the way trees age slowly, inwardly stood at the center. He held nothing, wore no robe, said no prayer. He simply looked at each face, each pair of eyes, and said, "We are here." The blacksmith nodded. The potter wept. The Viking placed his hand on the carved gatepost. And the boy looked up at you, then looked back to the field and whispered, "And so it begins again." That night the fire burned higher than it had in months. Not with fear, but with fullness. The stars poured overhead like river water. Someone sang a song without words, a tune passed down from lips that had long forgotten its origin. Others joined. The circle hummed. The wind curled around it, but did not enter. You watched the boy fall asleep beneath the stars. Arms tucked beneath his head, a blade of barley still clenched in one hand. You covered him with your cloak and sat beside him, hands calloused, heart still. And you thought not of war or peace, but of weight, the kind that roots carry, the kind that hands hold, the kind that remains when everything else moves on. You thought of the first shadow, of the second winter, of the cracking door and the figure that never truly left. And you thought we held, not because we were strong, but because we stayed. Dawn came slowly. The sun, when it rose, passed through the cracks of the chapel, through the holes in the old fence, through the barley stalks still standing. It painted the square in gold, and the air smelled not of ash or snow or rain, but of something growing. You stood once more in the field. The boy joined you, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. You both looked out at the rows cut, bundled, cleared, and then at the dark soil between. "Tomorrow, you said, we'll turn it again." He nodded. And from somewhere far off, the wind carried back the sound of footsteps, soft, slow, sure. Not ghosts, not raiders, just the future, approaching. And for the first time you did not brace for it. You opened the gate and let it in.